The Korean War was a war between North and South Korea, in which a United Nations force led by the United States of America fought for the South, and China fought for the North, which was also assisted by the Soviet Union. The war arose from the division of Korea at the end of World War II and from the global tensions of the Cold War that developed immediately afterwards. Korea was ruled by Japan from 1910 until the closing days of World War II. In August 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and, by agreement with the United States, occupied Korea north of the 38th parallel. U.S. forces subsequently occupied the south and Japan surrendered. By 1948, two separate governments had been set up. Both governments claimed to be the legitimate government of Korea, and neither side accepted the border as permanent. The conflict escalated into open warfare when North Korean forces, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea on 25 June 1950. On that day, the United Nations Security Council recognized this North Korean act as invasion and called for an immediate ceasefire. On 27 June, the Security Council adopted S-Res. 83, Complaint of Aggression upon the Republic of Korea, and decided the formation and dispatch of the UN forces in Korea. 21 countries of the United Nations eventually contributed to the defense of South Korea, with the United States providing 88% of the UN's military personnel. After the first 2 months of the conflict, South Korean forces were on the point of defeat, forced back to the Pusan perimeter. In September 1950, an amphibious UN counter-offensive was launched at Incheon, and cut off many of the North Korean attackers. Those that escaped envelopment and capture were rapidly forced back north all the way to the border with China at the Yalu River, or into the mountainous interior. At this point, in October 1950, Chinese forces crossed the Yalu and entered the war. Chinese intervention triggered a retreat of UN forces which continued until mid-1951. After these dramatic reversals of fortune, which saw Seoul change hands 4 times, the last 2 years of conflict became a war of attrition, with the front line close to the 38th parallel. The war in the air, however, was never a stalemate. North Korea was subject to a massive bombing campaign. Jet fighters confronted each other in air-to-air combat for the first time in history, and Soviet pilots covertly flew in defense of their communist allies. The fighting ended on 27 July 1953, when an armistice was signed. The agreement created the Korean Demilitarized Zone to separate North and South Korea, and allowed the return of prisoners. However, no lasting peace treaty has been signed, and the two Koreas are technically still at war. Periodic clashes, many of which were deadly, have continued to the present. Names. In the U.S., the war was initially described by President Harry S. Truman as a police action, as it was an undeclared military action, conducted under the auspices of the United Nations. It has been referred to in the Anglosphere as the Forgotten War, or the Unknown War, because of the lack of public attention it received both during and after the war, and in relation to the global scale of World War II, which preceded it, and the subsequent angst of the Vietnam War, which succeeded it. In South Korea, the war is usually referred to as 625, or the 625 upheaval, Jokyeodongyeon, reflecting the date of its commencement on 25 June. In North Korea, the war is officially referred to as the Fatherland Liberation War, or alternatively, the Choson Korean War. In China, the war is officially called the War to Resist U.S. Aggression and Aid Korea, although the term Chaozhan War is also used in unofficial contexts, along with the term Korean conflict, more commonly used in regions such as Hong Kong and Macau. Background. A decade later, after defeating Imperial Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan made Korea its protectorate with the Yalta Treaty in 1905, then annexed it with the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty in 1910. Many Korean nationalists fled the country. A provisional government of the Republic of Korea was founded in 1919 in nationalist China. It failed to achieve international recognition, failed to unite nationalist groups, and had a fractious relationship with its American-based founding president, Syngman Rhee. From 1919 to 1925 and beyond, Korean communists led internal and external warfare against the Japanese. Korea was considered to be part of the Empire of Japan as an industrialized colony along with Taiwan, and both were part of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. In 1937, the colonial governor-general, General Jiro Minami, commanded the attempted cultural assimilation of Korea's 23.5 million people by banning the use and study of Korean language, literature, and culture, to be replaced with that of mandatory use and study of their Japanese counterparts. Starting in 1939, the populace was required to use Japanese names under the Soshi Kaimai policy. Conscription of Koreans for labor in war industries began in 1939, with as many as 2 million Koreans conscripted into either the Japanese army or into the Japanese labor force. In China, the Nationalists, National Revolutionary Army and the Communist People's Liberation Army helped organize refugee Korean patriots and independence fighters against the Japanese military, which had also occupied parts of China. The nationalist-backed Koreans, led by Yipom Sok, fought in the Burma Campaign. The Communists, led by Kim Il-sung among others, fought the Japanese in Korea and Manchuria. During World War II, Japan used Korea's food, livestock, and metals for their war effort. Japanese forces in Korea increased from 46,000 soldiers in 1941 to 300,000 in 1945. Japanese Korea conscripted 2.6 million forced laborers controlled with a collaborationist Korean police force. Some 723,000 people were sent to work in the overseas empire and in metropolitan Japan. By 1942, Korean men were being conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. By January 1945, Koreans made up 32% of Japan's labor force. At the end of the war, other world powers did not recognize Japanese rule in Korea and Taiwan. At the Cairo Conference in November 1943, China, the United Kingdom, and United States all decided, in due course Korea shall become free and independent. Soviet-Japanese War at the Tehran Conference in November 1943 and the Yalta Conference in February 1945. The Soviet Union promised to join its allies in the Pacific War within 3 months of the victory in Europe. Accordingly, it declared war on Japan on 9 August 1945. By the 10th of August, the Red Army had begun to occupy the northern part of the Korean peninsula. On the night of the 10th of August in Washington, American Colonels Dean Rusk and Charles H. Bonner Steele III were tasked with dividing the Korean peninsula into Soviet and U.S. occupation zones and proposed the 38th parallel. This was incorporated into America's General Order No. 1, which responded to the Japanese surrender on 15 August. Explaining the choice of the 38th parallel, Rusk observed, even though it was further north than could be realistically reached by U.S., he noted that he was faced with the scarcity of U.S. forces immediately available, and time and space factors, which would make it difficult to reach very far north before Soviet troops could enter the area. As Rusk's comments indicate, the Americans doubted whether the Soviet government would agree to this. Stalin, however, maintained his wartime policy of cooperation, and on 16 August the Red Army halted at the 38th parallel for 3 weeks to await the arrival of U.S. forces in the south. Korea divided on 8 September 1945. U.S. Lt. Gen. John R. Hodge arrived in turn to accept the Japanese surrender south of the 38th parallel. Appointed as military governor, General Hodge directly controlled South Korea as head of the United States Army military government in Korea. He established control by restoring to power the key Japanese colonial administrators. But in the face of Korean protests, he quickly reversed this decision. The USAMGIK refused to recognize the provisional government of the short-lived People's Republic of Korea because it suspected it was communist. In December 1945, Korea was administered by a U.S.-Soviet Union Joint Commission, as agreed at the Moscow Conference, with the aim of granting independence after a 5-year trusteeship. The idea was not popular among Koreans and riots broke out. To contain them, the USAMGIK banned strikes on 8 December 1945 and outlawed the Park Revolutionary Government and the Park People's Committees on 12 December 1945. The right-wing Representative Democratic Council, led by Syngman Rhee, who had arrived with the U.S. military, opposed the trusteeship, arguing that Korea had already suffered from foreign occupation far too long. General Hodge began to distance himself from the proposal, even though it had originated with his government. On 23 September 1946, an 8,000-strong railroad worker strike began in Busan. Civil disorder spread throughout the country in what became known as the Autumn Uprising. On 1 October 1946, Korean police killed 3 students in the Daegu Uprising. Protesters counter-attacked, killing 38 policemen. On 3 October, some 10,000 people attacked the Yongchon police station, killing 3 policemen and injuring some 40 more. Elsewhere, some 20 landlords and pro-Japanese South Korean officials were killed. The USAMGIK declared martial law. Citing the inability of the Joint Commission to make progress, the U.S. government decided to hold an election under United Nations auspices with the aim of creating an independent Korea. The Soviet authorities and the Korean Communists refused to cooperate on the grounds it would not be fair, and many South Korean politicians also boycotted it. A general election was held in the South on 10 May 1948. It was marred by terrorism and sabotage, resulting in 600 deaths. North Korea held parliamentary elections 3 months later on 25 August. The resultant South Korean government promulgated a national political constitution on 17 July 1948. And elected Syngman Rhee as president on 20 July 1948. The Republic of Korea was established on 15 August 1948. In the Russian-Korean zone of occupation, the Soviet Union established a communist North Korean government led by Kim Il-sung. President Rhee's regime excluded communists and leftists from southern politics. Disenfranchised, they headed for the hills, to prepare for guerrilla war against the U.S.-sponsored ROC government. Meanwhile, on 3 April 1948, what began as a demonstration commemorating Korean resistance to Japanese rule ended with the Jeju Uprising, where between 14,000 and 60,000 people died. South Korean soldiers carried out large-scale atrocities during the suppression of the uprising. In October 1948, some South Korean soldiers mutinied against the clampdown in the Yosu-Suncheon Rebellion. The Soviet Union withdrew as agreed from Korea in 1948, and U.S. troops withdrew in 1949. On 24 December 1949, South Korean forces killed 86 to 88 people in the Mungyung massacre and blamed the crime on marauding communist bands. By early 1950, Syngman Rhee had about 30,000 alleged communists in jails and about 300,000 suspected sympathizers enrolled in the Bodo League re-education movement. Chinese Civil War. With the end of the war with Japan, the Chinese Civil War resumed between the Chinese Communists and the Chinese Nationalists. While the Communists were struggling for supremacy in Manchuria, they were supported by the North Korean government with material and manpower. According to Chinese sources, the North Koreans donated 2,000 railway cars worth of material, while thousands of Koreans served in the Chinese People's Liberation Army during the war. North Korea also provided the Chinese Communists in Manchuria with a safe refuge for non-combatants and communications with the rest of China. The North Korean contributions to the Chinese Communist victory were not forgotten after the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. As a token of gratitude, between 50,000 to 70,000 Korean veterans that served in the PLA were sent back along with their weapons, and they later played a significant role in the initial invasion of South Korea. China promised to support the North Koreans in the event of a war against South Korea. The Chinese support created a deep division between the Korean Communists, and Kim Il-sung's authority within the Communist Party was challenged by the Chinese faction led by Pak Il-yu, who was later purged by Kim. After the formation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Chinese government named the Western nations, led by the United States, as the biggest threat to its national security. Basing this judgment on China's century of humiliation beginning in the early 19th century, American support for the Nationalists during the Chinese Civil War, and the ideological struggles between revolutionaries and reactionaries, the Chinese leadership believed that China would become a critical battleground in the United States' crusade against communism. As a countermeasure and to elevate China's standing among the worldwide communist movements, the Chinese leadership adopted a foreign policy that actively promoted communist revolutions throughout territories on China's periphery.